then,
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends, family. And let me restate that. Let me welcome you. Good evening, gentlemen and gentle ladies. For I think that probably our gentle ladies tend to be more gentle than the men are. It is my privilege this evening to welcome Derek Sainsbury as our guest speaker. Before introducing him, though, I do want to give you an update because over the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks since July 21, when the terrible accident occurred in Iowa where 3 girls were killed and Abby Barnes was put in a coma. She remains, to the best of my knowledge, in a coma. As of yesterday, although I saw that the Caring Bridge had over 40,000 representations of people expressing their prayers and concern for her. And so if you continue to add your prayers on her behalf, she is the one survivor of the 4 girls that got hit by the truck. And she is the Barnes family and the Barth families have been neighbors for 80 years, 5 generations, and it's close to home for us to have one of our dear neighbors so sadly injured. There is decent prospect that she'll be going to Madonna, the hospital in Omaha where they specialize in brain damage. We'll check. Well, I anticipate that probably later this week. But anyway, would like to continue to ask for your prayers for the Barnes family. Derek Sainsbury is the author of Storming the Nation, which is a refinement of his dissertation for his PhD from the University of Utah. I encountered that when I was working on the story of the Mansion House because I found it fascinating that earlier studies had come up with about 300 people who had gone out of Nauvoo volunteering to campaign for Joseph Smith. And then I encountered Derek's PhD project and discovered that here he had 611 people that were campaigners for Joseph Smith. They're also campaigners for the Book of Mormon, and therefore we can really justify having him as a guest speaker. But he contributes as well to the volunteer content for the Doctrine and Covenant Central, fair, faithful answers to criticisms of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and Public Square. He's married to his high school sweetheart, Meredith Pittett. Wanted to check, and because I think he indicated that she was having some health issues, but we prayed about that, and it's taken a bit of delay, but we got it. And they have 3 sons, Bryant, Nathan, and Joshua. He likes to spend time with his family and the dogs, and spends a good deal of time researching and writing history, particularly the 19th century history of the Latter-day Saint movement. The fact that he discovered more than 300 campaigners, more than what were previously known, to me is a tremendous accomplishment and worth a PhD right there in that case. So anyway, this evening we welcome Dr. Sainsbury to the forum. Thank you, sir, for showing up to begin to get acquainted with us, and we'll anticipate you'll have an opportunity to present and then opportunity to address questions and answers afterwards. Let us pray. Great Governor of the universe, whose creation emerged from an outstretched hand, whose beautiful earth in the Milky Way and everything that we see, all the soils, grasses, flowers, trees spread across the land, whose hand reached out to Peter, who tried to walk on the Galilean way, whose hand reaches out to us to assist when we, like Peter, step forward among the brave, who, in spite of our insignificance, calls us by name and invites us to eternity, and invites us to be stewards of a kingdom of peace we can faintly see. So we step forward bravely, like Peter, calling for your hand, to walk with you on water, but far more securely on land.
sorry, I'm stuck.
It move.
It does. There we go.
This evening, we ask your blessing on our presenter, Derek Sainsbury, who will help us understand theodemocracy and other governing forms in whose interest we should curry, and help us embrace the kind of government we really should seek for the land of promise, of the righteous, homeland of the meek. For as we study history and see so much dysfunction, selfishness, incompetence, we fear the past beneath our feet and want to guide our future chance. So help us learn a better way, led by your guiding hand, so we can bravely step forward upon the promised land. In the name of the Christ, his hand is stretched out still. Amen. So, Sainsbury, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that prayer. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to share with such a wonderful and diverse group. Are you seeing, is it showing up as my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
Good. Perfect. Okay, well, just so you can, maybe why would you want to listen to this kid? A little bit of my background. As was mentioned, I got my PhD in American history. I taught in the seminaries and institutes of the Latter-day Saint, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for almost 30 years. And I'm in my fourth year at Brigham Young University's Religious Department, where I'm an associate professor. And so when I returned from a Latter-day Saint mission I served in Italy. When I came home, I somehow came across the fact that Joseph Smith ran for president, and I was getting my bachelor's in political science, and that didn't seem to sit well with me, that he was involved politically because of my naive nature, but also the church's stance against political favoritism or sponsoring. And so it's only kind of the really thing that's ever really bothered me about Latter-day Saint history of all groups. And so I just decided to get a PhD and do my best. And so here we go. We mean to elect him, penned Apostle Willard Richards in a letter to the Saints' influential ally, John Arlington Bennett of Long Island. The date was June 20th, 1844. On behalf of Joseph Smith, Richards was responding to Bennett's recent letter, wherein he wrote that Joseph's campaign for president of the United States, as far as politics goes, was a, quote, wild goose chase. On June 20th, Nauvoo was in chaos. The Nauvoo expositor, with distorted half-truths and acerbic accusations, had exposed Nauvoo's two great secrets, plural marriage and the Council of 50. When Richards wrote to Bennett, Joseph had already ordered the destruction of the expositor's press, been arrested for riot twice, yet released by friendly courts, and had declared martial law in Nauvoo as anti-Mormon mobs began to circle. Despite all this, Richards was adamant that they were doubling down on the election. Quote, "We mean to elect him, and nothing shall be wanting on our part to accomplish it. And why? Because we are fully satisfied that this is the best or only method of saving our free institutions from total overthrow." End quote. For the Saints, the unfortunate but hauntingly familiar storm gathering around Nauvoo only highlighted why Joseph's campaign was necessary. Instead, a week later, Joseph's bullet-ridden body marked him as the first assassinated presidential candidate in United States history. Why did Joseph run for president? How serious was his campaign? Was he a serious contender before his death, or if he had lived, could he have been? Several articles, book chapters, and small treatises have offered a wide variety of answers. My book, Storming the Nation, The Unknown Contributions of Joseph Smith's Political Missionaries, released in 2020, was the first academic book-length treatment of the election and the electioneers. It was followed the following year in 2021 by Spencer McBride's book, Joseph Smith for President. Due to the publication in 2016 of the Council of 15 Minutes, we both had the advantage of knowing church leaders' private deliberations about the campaign. The minutes only strengthened what my dissertation earlier in 2016 had argued and what our books have concluded. Joseph ran a very serious campaign for president, but he was not a very serious to win. Or as Bennett had written to Richards, if you can by any supernatural means elect Brother Joseph Smith president, I have no doubt he would govern the people and administer the laws in good faith and with righteous intentions. But I can see no natural means by which he has the slightest chance of receiving the votes of even one state, end quote. While Joseph, church leaders, and their hundreds of electioneer missionaries sincerely believed a heavenly influence, perhaps even would, pave the way to victory, historically speaking, absent any such influence, the prophet's chances were negligible. So why did he run? The most succinct surface level answer is that Joseph wanted to protect the Latter-day Saints and other religious minorities from very real and very present persecution. The wider, deeper, and more meaningful answer is more complex, but is crucial to understanding the campaign and beliefs and actions of church leaders and their electioneer missionaries. This deeper understanding has metaphorical roots, a trunk, and branches of fruit. As the trunk, the campaign was the prophet's practical application of two revelatory roots to his contingent realities that he hoped would bring the desired fruit of government protection. The first root was the cause of Zion. New scripture defined Zion as a society whose inhabitants were one in mind, a political governing component, one in heart, a social connecting component, dwelt in righteousness, a religious spiritual component, and there were no poor among them, an economic component. Other revelations required the saints to gather, build a temple city, and establish Zion with all her components in order to prepare for Christ's millennial return and reign. However, each component conflicted with contemporary Americans, particularly on the frontier where God told the saints to build Zion. Visions, new scripture, and revelations, coupled with gathering together under priesthood authority, seemed blasphemous and despotic to an individualistic and democratic Protestant America that preached sola scriptura. Collective political power in the name of religion, untethered to political parties, was an anathema in an age of individual liberty and partisan party politics. Building a community that declared all peoples as equals collided with frontier individuals looking for freedom and isolation, and who viewed immigrants, American Indians, and Blacks as lesser beings. Economic consecrated cooperation challenged individualistic, speculative market forces. Logically, conflicting beliefs on the 19th century frontier often meant vigilante violence against minorities. Mobs persecuted and exiled the saints attempting to build Zion, first from Jackson County and then from the entire state of Missouri. As Joseph pled with the Lord, he received revelations that included heavenly truths about and instructions on how to interact with government and the Constitution of the United States, that the Lord had, quote, instituted by the hands of wise men whom he had raised up unto this very purpose, end quote. These truths and instructions, which I will label divine constitutionalism, became the second revelatory root of the 1844 campaign. In these revelations, Joseph learned that the Constitution, quote, should be maintained for the rights and protection of all flesh, according to just and holy principles. And it is not right that any man should be in bondage one to another, end quote. Further, the Lord explained, quote, when the wicked rule, the people mourn. Wherefore honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men you should observe to uphold. End quote. Thus began Joseph's articulation of aristarchy, a contemporary term defined as a body of good men in power or government by excellent men. In an official church motto published just 6 months before the extermination order, Joseph declared, quote, "The Constitution of our country, formed by the fathers of liberty, peace and good order in society, love to God and goodwill to men, all good and wholesome laws, and virtue and truth above all things, and aristarchy live forever." End quote. Beside aristarchy, this motto spoke of good, wholesome, virtuous, truthful, and godly government, something Joseph would later term theodemocracy, where, quote, "God and the people hold the power to conduct the affairs of men in righteousness for the benefit of all," end quote. Additionally, the Lord commanded the saints to work within the government system to seek redress from the government. However, they were unsuccessful, including with President Martin Van Buren, who famously told the prophet to his face, quote, "Your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you," end quote. Joseph believed that politics and government were corrupt and broken and would not help them. Zion, now in Nauvoo, Illinois, needed the protection of correct and powerful self-government to avoid a repeat of Missouri, which the saints fortuitously received in the Nauvoo Charter and Legion. The two revelatory roots, Zion's unity governance and defending the rights of the saints and others with divine constitutionalism, continued to develop in the contingent context of the Nauvoo era. In 1842 and 1843, Joseph created a Theo-Democratic Relief Society. He revealed temple anointings of kings and queens, priests and priestesses, taught about a future theocracy, and nominated at the temple site the correct men for elected office. For example, Joseph was elected mayor and Hiram and many apostles to the city council, while friendly non-Mormon candidates won county office. These were all steps that led to establishing aristarchic theodemocracy and consequently Joseph's presidential campaign and the Council of 50. Theo-democratic Zion, however, in Nauvoo, created confrontation from inside and outside the church. Looking for protection, Joseph wrote to the 5 potential presidential candidates of 1844, asking, quote, "What will be relative to us as a people should fortune favor your ascension to the chief magistrate?" None offered help. Therefore, on the 20th of January, 1844, church leaders nominated Joseph for president and committed to, quote, "use all honorable means to secure his election," end quote, which included having independent electors for the Electoral College. Creating the infrastructure to translate possible states won into proper electoral votes reveals a serious campaign, not a mere protest or public relations effort. Joseph's enthusiastic response to his candidacy exhibited his sincere intent. He would send missionaries, quote, throughout the land to electioneer, make stump speeches, and advocate the Mormon religion, end quote. The electioneers would advocate for a type of national unity that, realistically, had only existed under George Washington. The new presidential candidate boasted that, quote, "there is oratory enough in the church to carry me into the presidential chair, the first slide," end quote. These were resolute words, concrete plans, and ideals outlining a serious campaign, but only if the ideas, words, and plans were put into action. Over the next 5 months, they were. The two intertwined roots, unifying Zion government and divine constitutionalism to protect all people, fused into the prophet's campaign. Joseph published a political pamphlet named General Smith's views of the powers and policy of the government in the United States, which I will continue to refer to as views. Scholars have studied how the pamphlet's ideas fit into the wider political context and circumstances that led Joseph to advocate them. However, his proposals also came from one or both revelatory roots. Here are just two examples. Joseph called for the end of slavery through gradual remunerated emancipation using monies from the sales of public land. As you remember, in the revelatory roots, Zion was open to everyone, and the rights of the Constitution belonged to all mankind, including Black slaves, for as the Revelation said, living in bondage one to another was not right. The prophet candidate's chief concern was that the United States Constitution and government had failed his people. At that time, the Constitution only protected the Bill of Rights at the federal level, not within the individual states, which had allowed for the tragedy of Missouri. Joseph pronounced, quote, "I am the greatest advocate of the Constitution, but it is not broad enough to cover the whole ground," end quote. Joseph proposed that the president have power to protect the rights of all people within the states. Joseph again returned to the revelation that the Constitution was to protect the rights of all people, including unpopular minorities like the Latter-day Saints. The least discussed part of Joseph's platform has been his call to restore virtuous, unified government. He believed that vain and corrupt political parties and politicians had led the nation into political apostasy. Joseph had intended to, quote, "restore the government to its pristine health and vigor," end quote, and called on fellow Americans to cheerfully help restore the nation's unity. He unashamedly pronounced that as president, he would supplicate God, quote, "for the good of all people." His primary message was unity is power, the very foundation of Zion in God's revelations. On March 11th, 1844, Joseph established the Council of 50. It was the final fusion of these two revelatory roots of Zion governance and divine constitutionalism. Considered separate from the church, the Confidential Council of 50 considered itself the literal political kingdom of God, established to protect Zion and the rights of all, and to prepare to eventually govern on the earth during the second coming and into the millennium. The revelatory title of this confidential council was, quote, "the kingdom of God and his laws, with the keys and power thereof, and judgment in the hands of his servants, Amen Christ," end quote. It was the ultimate expression of Aristarchic theodemocracy. Joseph selected by revelation good, honest, and wise men who were mostly anointed kings, Aristarchy, to govern as a living constitution that counseled together with heaven to find God's will, accept it, and then execute it on behalf of all people, theodemocracy. The council explored several options to defend Zion before settling on the election as, quote, "the easiest and best way to accomplish the object in view," stating that, quote, "all who could should go electioneering." Joseph said, quote, "they will have more power and might and more means than ever had before, an hundredfold," end quote. Willard Richards wrote similar sentiments about the missionaries to a distant church leader. Quote, "if God goes with them, who can withstand their influence," end quote. Speakers at the April 1844 General Conference strongly hinted at the ideas being shared in the Council of 50. Ideas which were wrapping church and state closer together. In context of repeated teachings of a literal kingdom of God and their prophet energetically running for president, the saints understood they were to offer the nation religious and political salvation. The missionaries, called on the fourth and final day of the conference, would be the messengers. An assembly of 1,200 men learned that the church was sending electioneer missionaries to every state, preaching the restored gospel and politicking for Joseph. The apostles would attend scheduled conferences throughout the states to promote both objectives. At these and other meetings, designated state leaders would organize the electioneers and choose state electors for the Electoral College. The rhetoric in this meeting was direct, enthusiastic, and confident. For example, Hiram Smith declared, quote, "You will have a great deal of knowledge. We want you to be successful. Electioneer with all the people and exhort them to do the thing that is right," end quote, meaning vote for Joseph. Brigham Young bellowed, quote, "This is a fire that cannot be put out. We will turn the world upside down," end quote. Brigham Young then called for volunteers. 271 immediately signed up that day. The following week, Nauvoo newspapers published a list of missionaries, now numbering 336 with their respective assignments. In my decade plus of research, I have found now a total of 624 electioneers, not including the 12 apostles, almost doubling the number of missionaries we previously understood were involved. They were called in four ways: 336, or 54% of them, at or just after that April conference. 145, or 23%, were called from the Nauvoo area, but after April 15th. 23, or 4%, were already serving missions and switched to electioneering, and 115, or 19%, were called in the scheduled conferences throughout the nation. This cadre of electioneers was the largest missionary effort in Joseph's lifetime, another strong indication that the campaign was serious. In fact, the next time this many missionaries were in the field was 1905, 60 years later. Still today, there has never been a missionary group as proportionately large relative to total membership. What were the electioneer demographics? Their average age was 35. Samuel Bent at 66 was the oldest, and at 16, Charles H. Bassett was the youngest. Their average length of membership in the 14-year-old church was 6 years, with Ezra Thayer among the very first converts and Breed Searle being baptized during the campaign, and then 3/4 of the missionaries were married, 88% saints. Strikingly, only 36% had served a prior mission. 72% were ordained elders or 70s, and 80% had never held a leadership position in the church. Despite living in perhaps the most partisan era of American history, 85% had never held any political or elected position, nor had they even campaigned in previous elections. Economically, 45% were farmers and 1/4 were unskilled laborers. Most had experienced the hell of Missouri and the coldness of the government to their pleas for redress. Every man possible was encouraged to go, reversing a policy of only sending out missionaries with settled families and economic situations. This meant that some, like James C. Snow and Alfred Corden, left their families without even a pound of flour. Widowers left children in the charge of neighbors or even their oldest children. Some even sold family heirlooms to finance their missions. Despite the sacrifices, they left understanding the urgency of their missions. Electioneer John D. Lee, tearfully leaving his family, expressed, quote, "The importance of my mission came to my mind, banishing grief and anguish. I felt highly honored to electioneer for a prophet of God," end quote. This map shows the number of electioneers assigned to each of the states and territories. New York, with 133, had almost twice as many as the next highest, Illinois, with 70. Church leaders usually assign the missionaries to their former home states to build a base of support among family and friends. The campaign was headquartered in Nauvoo and New York City. Newspapers in both cities advocated Joseph, published reports of conferences, and created confidence in the campaign. Electioneers walked, rode horses or in carriage, took steamboats and canal boats, and even used the few railroads available. Yet all walked some of the way, and most walked all of the way. Here are 2 companionships assigned to Vermont, one of the furthest states from Nauvoo. State campaign president Erastus Snow and William Hyde departed by steamboat on April 30th, as seen here in blue. They switched boats in St. Louis, disembarked in Pittsburgh, took canal boats and railroads across several states, and arrived in Burlington, Vermont on May 14th, in 2 weeks. On the left in red, recent converts and English immigrants, James Burgess and Alden, left May 5th without a dollar between them. They traveled the entire 1,177 miles on foot, reaching Burlington, Vermont on July 20th, only to hear at the end of their 7-week journey that Joseph was dead. However, like the other missionaries, Gordon and Burgess preached and politicked all along the way. Electioneers taught and campaigned constantly on steamboats, canal boats, and railroads, in private homes, public squares, schoolhouses, courthouses, large rented public halls, and even at extended camp meetings. Lorenzo Snow, one of the campaign presidents for Ohio, was the very first to leave. He departed by steamboat on April 10th, the day following the electioneer meeting, and, quote, delivered the first political lecture that was ever delivered to the world in favor of Joseph Smith for president, end quote. Snow illustrates in word and deed the general work and reception of the electioneers. He procured copies of Joseph's Views pamphlet and crisscrossed the state, distributing them and stumping for Joseph. He held his organizing convention in the Kirtland Temple, an appropriate venue given the dual nature of their missions. He then assigned the electioneers specific congressional districts, actions, a fellow Latter-day Saints to this unique campaign. Quote, many people, both saints and Gentiles, thought this a broad stroke of policy. Our own people generally were quite willing to use their influence and devote their time and energies to the promotion of the object in view. To many persons who knew nothing of Joseph, but through the ludicrous reports in circulation, the movement seemed a species of insanity, while others, with no less astonishment, hailed it as a beacon of prosperity to our national destiny, end quote. I want to give you a small taste of the electioneers' experiences, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as they stormed preaching and politicking. Much good followed the missionaries. They proclaimed to anyone who would listen the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith as prophet, and the restoration of priesthood authority. Their preaching netted several hundred baptisms, including some family and friends. Daniel D. Hunt and Lindsay Brady baptized over 20 people in Kentucky. 12 were Hunt's relatives. Even when families and friends rejected the message, the missionaries enjoyed spending time with loved ones. Moses and Nancy Tracy, Nancy being the lone female electioneer, brought their 4 children with them to New York to meet their grandparents and parents for the last time. While called to work in New York, David Pettigrew also spent time visiting, including placing gravestones on his parents' long unmarked graves. Most developed strong friendships with their companions or deepened existing ones. Alfred Gordon and James Burgess, who we talked about earlier, became lifelong friends, even after Burgess refused to follow Brigham Young west. Wilford Woodruff was thrilled to work in Maine with Milton Holmes, a former companion he had not seen for a decade. Often it was a family affair. German immigrant brothers George and John Reiser labored in the German-speaking areas of Ohio. 18-year-old Lorenzo Hatch and 26-year-old Thomas Fulmer traveled east together. Hatch became extremely ill from sleeping so often in the rain, and they stopped at Fulmer's parents' house in New York for him to convalesce. He quickly fell in love with his nurse, Thomas's 17-year-old sister Hannah. When Father Fulmer figured out what was happening, he sent Lorenzo packing to his assignment in Vermont. When Hatch returned to Nauvoo the following year, 1845, Hannah was with them. They had eloped. The electioneers also experienced many of the feelings and experiences common to missionary work. Franklin D. Richard penned letters to his bride. Alfred Corden thought parts of Michigan looked like his native England, bringing pangs for faraway family and friends. Several went sightseeing. Those in or traveling through upstate New York often visited Niagara Falls and the Hill Cumorah. William Appleby investigated the still smoldering ruins of a Catholic neighborhood decimated in the Philadelphia Bible riots. Some noted watching fireworks on Independence Day. More than one companionship crashed wedding receptions or other public events where there was food. In the middle of a terrifying lightning storm, Jeremiah Curtis and his nephew companion Joseph witnessed a bolt strike a man dead. Despite the odds, the electioneers found some success in their politicking. Most state campaign presidents, as we saw with Lorenzo Snow in Ohio, did not disappoint. Charles C. Rich and Harvey Green created a campaign machine in Michigan. They had views printed and distributed by the thousands and assigned companionships to congressional districts. All the while, they crisscrossed the state, stumping for Joseph and coordinating and encouraging their electioneers. Charles Wandel and Marcellus Bates did the same thing in New York, seemingly everywhere. Daniel Spencer had his electioneers in Massachusetts zeroed in on their congressional districts and created a good amount of public interest in Boston, leading to the campaign's largest convention. Into late June and early July, there was real but modest momentum building. Newspapers throughout the nation were commenting, mostly ridiculing, Joseph's campaign and his electioneers arriving in their states. However, non-Latter-day Saints attended these political conference meetings and stump speeches anywhere they happened. Electioneers often noted the interest and even approval of many regarding Joseph's policy ideas and the belief that the country needed reforming. In Kentucky, George Miller attended a large Whig Party political barbecue. Miller started talking about Joseph's views to some of his old acquaintances. Soon, more were trying to listen to Miller than the Whig speaker. Sensing the moment, Miller jumped up, quote, on a large stump and commenced reading aloud Joseph's views, end quote. Most of the crowd approved and abandoned the barbecue, carrying Miller on their shoulders to a tavern to feed him. A two-day mass meeting in New Hampshire, heavily attended by non-Latter-day Saints, had a, quote, spirited and interesting discussion, end quote, and passed resolutions with only 5 dissenting votes to use, quote, all lawful ways and means to reform the abuses of trust in power in government by backing independent candidates, end quote. The popularity of Joseph's views amongst the group rendered him, quote, worthy of the votes of all free and enlightened people, end quote. In most states, the electioneers were making some headway. Journalist articles on mass meetings in Boston and in New York proved the point. However, not all experiences were positive. Most electioneers left Nauvoo during the Great Flood of 1844. Incessant rain soaked their clothing, turned roads to mud, made river and stream crossings dangerous, and produced a plague of mosquitoes with malaria in their wake. Many went hungry for days with lack of money or charitable meals. Often denied housing because of who they were, they spent nights under the rain more than under the stars, with several becoming very ill. Jacob Hamblin was so desperate to sleep indoors and have a decent meal that he offered his extra clothes for payment, to no avail. Opponents injured some electioneers by throwing sticks, stones, and literally anything they could put their hands on. They particularly enjoyed spitting tobacco juice in missionaries' faces. For the people treated them like dogs. Adversaries also attacked the missionaries with insults, mocking, malicious lies, and by interrupting meetings. More than once, the electioneers and their candidates were called devils or worse. A man in Kentucky announced that John D. Lee and his companions were not even human, but part of the, quote, fish kind, end quote. Sometimes preaching and electioneering to family and friends brought retorts, alienation, and even permanent ending of relationships. Enemies tried to stop the electioneers any way they could. During a large meeting in New York City, someone intentionally broke in confusion. Many would strip View's pamphlets right out of the electioneers' hands and tear them up from the printing shops. This was especially prevalent in the South because Joseph's views called for the gradual emancipation of slaves. In Tennessee, campaign president Abraham O. Smoot ordered 3,000 copies of Views, but never received them. You see, a prominent attorney threatened to sue Smoot, the printer, and the church for allegedly violating a state law that forbade, quote, any publications calculated to excite discontent, insurrection, or rebellion amongst the slaves or free persons of color, end quote. Of course, the most difficult experience the electioneers faced murdered their prophet and presidential candidate. I'll cover that a little later. As bad as these experiences were, there were uglier ones. Opponents made death threats against Joseph. Eerily, in eastern Illinois, a few antagonists alleged that there were already men organized to assassinate Joseph before the election. The death threats extended to the missionaries as well. A man in Ohio publicly damned the missionaries and threatened to, quote, stain his hands with their blood, end quote, if they called Joseph a prophet. After George Miller's success at the Whig barbecue, someone ordered him to leave the area and stop, quote, preaching your religious views and political Mormonism, end quote, or his slaves would lynch him. In some cases, things progressed past threats. A mob tarred and feathered Eli McGinn. A few companionships faced mobs intent on killing them. Benjamin Brown and Jesse Crosby held the door to their room against ruffians 3 times in one night, a sad foreshadow of their prophet candidate who would fruitlessly attempt to hold the door against his assassins. David Hollister was electioneering with remarkable success on a steamboat when suddenly an enraged Missourian drew a Bowie knife. Hollister's bystanders intervened, perhaps saving both of their lives. In Boston, the convention for Joseph's campaign filled the 1,000-seat Melodeon Hall. Towards the end of what had been a successful day, generating good non-Latter-day Saint interest, chaos erupted. Several young Whig agitators started fistfights, which escalated until the police arrived. By then, most of the attendees had fled outside the convention. Abraham Smoot and his electioneers held a conference with interested locals in the courthouse of Dresden, Tennessee, when a mob launched bricks and sticks through the windows. A week later, they met again, this time with hickory sticks in hand. However, this time a larger mob, led by the local sheriff, forced their way in and surrounded the gathering. When one of the men moved to assault Smoot, Sister Camp, a 6-foot, 200-pound local Latter-day Saint, intervened. "You dare touch one of them elders," she roared, "and I will see your heart blood." The sheriff backed down, and Sister Camp led the missionaries out of the courthouse, hickory sticks at the ready. Outside, her husband, with shotgun in hand, was kicking one of the ruffians across the courthouse square. Ultimately, this ugly violence reached the electioneer's prophet and presidential candidate. A conspiracy of disaffected saints and Joseph's local and regional enemies printed the Nauvoo Expositor. With its destructions, the conspirators had what they needed: strong legal premises to pull Joseph from the protection of Nauvoo. Once imprisoned in Carthage jail, the prophet's fate was. In solemn conversation the morning of his death, June 27, 1844, Joseph lamented this was not the season they had supposed. Quote, "We have the revelation of Jesus. and the knowledge to organize a righteous government upon universal peace to all mankind if they would receive it. And they didn't. Later that day, the mob forced the prison and assassinated the president and presidential candidate, prophet and presidential candidate. The violent end of the campaign and traumatized the electioneers. News traveled slowly, and most heard the awful news weeks later. They had believed they were on heaven's errand to bring religious and political salvation to the nation. It had never entered their minds that it would all end in Joseph's assassination. Here are two of the dozens of recorded reactions from electioneers. The only female electioneer, Nancy Tracy, wrote, quote, "We were horror-stricken. My husband sobbed aloud. Is it true? Can it be true? When so short a time ago he set us apart to fulfill this mission and all was right," end quote. John Lovelace heard the news on a steamboat headed back to Nauvoo. Quote, "A perfect shout was set up by the devils incarnate in our boat, who were on their way to fight the Mormons. Had I possessed the strength of Samson, I would, like him, have sunk the whole mass in one gulf of oblivion and sent them to their congenial spirits, the howling devils of the infernal regions," end quote. Following the example of the apostles, most electioneers returned to Nauvoo. In one of his first addresses since assuming leadership of the church, Brigham Young spoke for his fellow electioneers, proclaiming, quote, "As rulers and people have taken counsel together against Joseph and have murdered him who would have reformed and saved the nation, it is not wisdom for the saints to have anything to do with politics, voting, or president making at present," end quote. End quote. The campaign with its martyred candidate was now officially over. The public and private words and actions of Joseph, other church leaders, and the electioneers conclusively show that the presidential campaign and its electioneers were serious. In Joseph's case, deadly serious. Just a week after his campaign began, he had declared, quote, "If I lose my life in a good cause, I am willing to be sacrificed on the altar of virtue, righteousness, and truth in maintaining the laws and Constitution of the United States, if need be, for the general good of mankind," end quote. That sober statement became a prophetic summation of his campaign. However, throughout the campaign, he and the electioneers believed they were doing something special. Joseph shared with prominent politicians that his election was, quote, "by no means unlikely," end quote. He told ordinary visitors who doubted his campaign that, quote, "the Lord will turn the heart of the people," end quote. The electioneers were true believers as well. One wrote in the pages of the Prophet the campaign newspaper, The Prophet, that Joseph, quote, "would be elected by a large majority," end quote. Eliza Snow, brother of first electioneer Lorenzo Snow, captured well the logic of the electioneers. Quote, "His friends were in earnest. They knew that through the revelations of God, he was in possession of a and more correct understanding of national policies and the needs of our own government than any other living man," end quote. So they preached, they politicked, they stood up to ridicule, contempt, and even violence, and were devastated when Joseph was killed. While they had truly meant to elect him, fellow Americans elected instead to exile the Latter-day Saints once again, this time from the nation. The campaign and its outcome demonstrated that there was still no room for the Latter-day Saints and their Zion in America. The Saints weren't alone in being persecuted. That same summer, nativist Protestants murdered Catholics and burned down their Philadelphia neighborhood. Freedom of religion was not for non-Protestant saints and Catholics who, despite being Caucasian, were not even considered white, but viewed as a separate race, more akin to American Indians, Mexicans, and Blacks. In 1846, the Saints fled the nation and began implementing what they called Joseph's measures, including creating Aristarchic Theo-Democratic Zion. Even though they soon found themselves in American territory again, they established a strong theodemocracy that would hold the federal government at bay for half a century, and the electioneers were right in the middle of it. The campaign had a strong, lasting, and identifiable effect on the electioneers. They became the fruit of the tree in our analogy. They developed into the foundation of the theodemocracy that the apostles built in the Great Basin. In fact, 83% of the electioneers followed the apostles west, compared to the estimated 50% of all 1844 saints. From 1844 to 1850, church leaders placed electioneers in 55% of available leadership positions, including all 4 new apostleships, despite only representing 15% of available priesthood leaders, or holders, excuse me. This trend of electioneers disproportionately filling leadership continued for decades. In the Great Basin, theodemocratic kingdom, religious position encompassed all of Zion's components. Church leaders nominated ecclesiastical leaders to parallel political offices, and the saints voted them in. For example, the bishop of a town was generally elected mayor. State presidencies served as territorial legislatures and county judges, and so on. As religious and political leaders, they were expected to practice plural marriage. Because men with plural wives received extra land for each wife, and as leaders, they often managed the natural resources and trade within their jurisdictions, they also became economic leaders. They were the workhorses of Zion, and disproportionately, they were elected. Question is why? There is no smoking gun document that says, because you electioneered, we'll call you to leadership. However, in my qualitative and quantitative research, as I wrote in my book, quote, no other pre-campaign variables could predict the high number of electioneers in postmodern leadership. Not income, previous church position, age, occupation, family connection, priesthood office, or missionary service were predictors of who would help lead Zion that autumn of 1844 and forward, end quote. So again, why? I see 3 reasons. First, their own words and actions in the campaign demonstrated that they believed in and sacrificed for theodemocracy. They believed Joseph and his campaign offered not just religious, but political salvation. Second, psychologists have long established that shared trauma creates strong relational bonds, even between strangers, let alone a group of men and one woman who were already one in mind and heart. The intense trauma of learning of Joseph's assassination forged unique bonds to one another, to the apostles who were campaigning with them, and to the cause of theodemocratic Zion. Third, the electioneers were in the social orbit of the apostles who came to lead. In the social orbit of the apostles who led, instructed, and labored with them. They experienced together the sacrifice for theodemocracy and the trauma of Joseph's tragic death. The 12 had seen the electioneers' work, knew their names and abilities and character. When the apostles assumed the helm, it came naturally to choose electioneers for leadership. Thus, excising any supernatural serious contender for president in 1844. Despite his charismatic gifts, an intriguing platform, and an army of electioneers, he was still the unpopular leader of an unpopular minority religion and was running as an independent in a political system dominated by the 2 great parties. Had he lived to the election, and again, no heavenly influence interfered, it is very doubtful that he would have, as James Arlington Bennett said, quote, received the votes of even one state, end quote. Yet, Joseph Smith's 1840 campaign for president was serious. The prophet candidate and his electioneers believed God's influence would be with them, and they exerted every effort to win the election until learning of Joseph's murder. Even with Joseph's death, the campaign and campaigners would have serious significance for the Latter-day Saints. The revelatory ideas of the campaign and campaigners themselves would directly influence and direct Aristarchic theo-democratic Zion for decades in the Great Basin. To end with, I want to share three quick things. First, doing my research, I was surprised to learn that my fourth great-grandfather, Nathaniel Ashby, was an electioneer missionary assigned to Massachusetts. He labored there with various companions and attended the mass convention that I talked about earlier that ended in a free-for-all fistfight. This leads me to the second item. These electioneers have tens of thousands of living descendants, 99.9% of whom have no idea that their ancestor campaigned for Joseph Smith, and thus miss out on this important part of their family history. I have a website you can access called stormingthenation.com that lists all 624 electioneers, plus the quorum of 12 who led them. If you know of any church ancestors in America during 1844, it is worth your time to see if they were electioneers. I feel a special camaraderie with these men and Sister Tracy, having dedicated 15 years to them, their campaign, their courage, their conviction, and their clarity of purpose, the cause of Zion. Finally, see if this sounds familiar. The electioneers campaigned in a time of government corruption, blinding bigotry, intense partisanship, partisan and misleading media reports, riots, and political violence. Meanwhile, the views pamphlet they carried had this simple phrase: unity is power. May we be as committed and courageous to promote unity in our time. Thank you.
And thank you. What a delightful presentation. As a host, I get the privilege of the first question, and I have so many to choose from that I'm hard pressed to determine which one it should be. But since you concluded here with this remarkable parallel to the modern situation, then I would be interested in allowing you to expand a little bit upon what you just left us with, because it would appear that we don't have any profit running.
No profit running. No profit running. I find it interesting. I mean, if you've followed any of the recent news of statements by the First Presidency of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in June, they sent out a letter that was read in all the congregations about protecting and saving democracy, and about voting for those same revelations. They quote the same revelations we were talking about with Joseph Smith about voting for good, honest, and wise people, not voting blindly for political parties or based on tradition, but doing the work to study the issues, study the candidates, and prayerfully make decisions that that will help not only lead the nation but protect our democracy. We live in very interesting times. Many historians, and I would tend to agree with them, looking at the intense polarization and partisanship and the media fragmenting back to what existed back in the 19th century of all the media belonging to a political party, one or the other. That's kind of what's happened in the past couple decades here. Are very worried about, and I am too, very worried about the time that's coming now, the next presidential election. Worried about civil unrest, about the fact that unity as a nation, which, I mean, obviously there's never been complete unity in the nation. Let's not kid ourselves, but the intense nature of the partisanship and the unwillingness to compromise, to view others as people and their ideas as sincere, is, something that I think Joseph and his electioneers could relate to, and they were trying to do something about it. They were trying to bring unity. and not just it wasn't just about them. They were working with non-Latter-day Saints. They had sent overtures to Catholic leaders in Philadelphia, wanting to get together to defend rights. So there's kind of a lot of ideas here that we could probably draw from in our own current context about being willing to give or allow for the rights of others, as the saints were trying to have for their own, and being willing to want to try and bring unity and compromise and at least understanding of other people's viewpoints.
It appears to me that the Book of Mormon is quite clear in advocating that democracy, or the voice of the people, I believe is the phrase it uses, is the means whereby we should be governed, although clearly it illustrates other strategies as well. I'm interested, and let me encourage other people to go to the reactions and raise your hand and get in line for the rest of the discussion, because I'll stop here and give other people a chance. But it would appear to me that the discussion on what the governance in Zion should be, what kind of governance should we be developing, is a question that we don't talk enough about.
Oh, I agree. And yet, I mean, the idea of theodemocracy, right, which those that followed Brigham Young and the apostles to the West were able to establish for 50 years, is that's not, from the outside, that doesn't look like some kind of democracy. That looks like theocracy. And so Joseph understood this, and kind of in a token effort, he actually had 3 non-Latter-day Saints from the Nauvoo era on the Council of 50. Of course, that's not representative of all at all of some kind of proportion as far as Latter-day Saints and non-Latter-day Saints, even in the county, right? But the idea was that it was supposed to be something different and supposed to be something unifying and based on original principles with changes, original principles of the Constitution with changes. For example, the emancipation of slaves and some of the other things he proposed.
No other hands there yet, so I'm going to jump back in. The comparison between the charter, the Constitution for the Kingdom of God, and the Constitution that Joseph Smith was running for president under, quite in contrast. We had an earlier presentation on those, and the contrast is rather remarkable. And we tend to find that people in a theocratic leadership position tend to use the power to their own advantage, and therefore, the theocracy. Clearly, when we look at the governments in our world that are theocratic today, Afghanistan as an example, then it's not the kind of place that most of us want to visit or go to live. And it would appear that Joseph Smith abused the power of his office in not allowing the right of due process several times in the later years of Nauvoo. Given that apparent abuse, then I'm highly suspecting of the theocracy part. It seems to me like men have no business putting themselves in the position of a theocrat.
Yeah, I think he would probably, you have to remember, he's looking at it through the lens of what happened in Missouri. And he's trying to, well, on the one hand, as we talked about, he believes in this idea of divine governance, that this is where all things are headed to with the return of Jesus Christ, where Christ will be king. And as the scriptures in the Bible and Doctrine and Covenants indicate, that the saints will, as kings and queens, rule with him 1,000 years. And so they saw that as being part of that. But the fact that, with the Nauvoo Charter, they're trying to set up this a kind of theodemocracy, and the rights that they get from the two political parties in Illinois did create unified government. And so from the outside, what you're saying is exactly right. I mean, it looks like theocracy, and on the inside, they're trying to not have Missouri happen again, and hoping that this government and this militia will be able to keep that from happening. And so, yeah, there's that tension you have to think about here of that what I was discussing earlier between the idea of theodemocracy and pluralism. I mean, how does that actually going to functionally work, right, in society? And this is a question that theologically, at least for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has some needs to, as you said, needs to be talked about a little bit, because the idea in the teachings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and John Taylor particularly, and later prophets, is that at the second coming of Jesus Christ, that Latter-day Saints will still be a significant minority of people on the earth, because all the good will endure to have the day, to see the day of Christ, and that at that time the kingdom of God, the political kingdom of God, will be completely established, which will be separate from the church, governing the whole world under Christ's leadership, because people will not be forced to join, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or other things like that. So it's not something we think about unless we start thinking about millennial and second coming kind of thought. But that's what Joseph was trying to think, as he saw the American experiment not working for his people, and he felt directed by revelation to move in this direction.
Well, then let's take it back to Nauvoo. I'm intrigued that Nauvoo perched right on the bank of the Mississippi. While it was part of Illinois, the Mississippi fundamentally should have been regulated by the federal government because of the Commerce Clause. And therefore, for the federal government to step in and make it so that there was that buffer between the territory of Iowa and where the Missouri troops were threatening to come in and capture or attack, to have the federal troops step in would have made sense. But as Joseph Smith continued to find, and as we find still the Civil War, we don't have the federal government reinforcing First Amendment rights. The federal government played its appropriate role. It would have changed history.
Yeah, in fact, the Saints during the campaign petitioned the Congress to create Nauvoo as a federal district and be under federal protection. So, yeah.
Bill Shepard has a question.
I want to change just a little bit and ask more of a logistical question. When the apostles were in the East, Orson or Brigham and the Pratts and so forth, how did they hear about the martyrdom, and how long did it take them to get back to Nauvoo?
So in those days, news traveled as fast as a horse or a steamboat. And so the news slowly made its way east as letters or newspapers from the west were delivered east. And so depending on how far away they were from Nauvoo, they heard days, weeks later. So the specific apostles you're talking about, and about 6 of them were either in the Boston area or in the Washington, D.C. area. And they're not finding out until mid-July what's happened. And so the they received letters from Sidney Rigdon in Pittsburgh, who he had gone there as the vice presidential candidate. He couldn't be in Illinois. He had to establish residency in his home state to run as vice president, since the president and the vice president have to come from different states. And he wrote to the apostles in the East to meet him in Pittsburgh to discuss the future of the church. And instead, they continued, moved directly towards Nauvoo, as did Rigdon. So Rigdon gets there in late July, early August, and the apostles, Parley P. Pratt gets there first of the ones that are returning, and then they're there in early August as well, but after Rigdon. So they once they get to Nauvoo, they send out letters to all the electioneers, and one of the electioneers, whose name escapes me right now, whose name shouldn't escape me, is sent back east with a copy of that letter to try and get everybody back to Nauvoo. So it took weeks. You know, they were, some of the greatest success that they had as electioneers was happening after Joseph Smith was already dead, and they just didn't know it.
Was Willard Richards essentially in charge of the church at Nauvoo?
In charge, he was negotiating with Emma and with the stake president, William Marks. But as far as official correspondence and all that going through, yeah, he was running the show, because John Taylor was also wounded and was recovering.
I have just a comment, and I wrote it down while you guys were talking, so I'll just display it. And I just wanted to say this: does it not? Why is it not showing?
I see it.
I don't see it. Does everybody see it?
It's in the chat.
Yeah, I see it.
Oh, okay.
With the infinite power of God, it makes you wonder why God didn't make this happen. Was Joseph a little too enthusiastic? Was God saying people were not ready, or maybe God was letting nature, so to speak, run its course, allowing the sins to be laid upon the heads of those perpetrators? I have no doubt that if God intended this type of political stance to take place, it would have happened.
Right. And Joseph never declared that his campaign was revelation. Now, the Council of 50, yes, was considered to be revelation. But it fit with all of the revelations that he had received that we talked about what to do. And as he mentioned, he was willing, he'd said the year before, I'm just as willing to die for a Baptist or a Lutheran as I am for a Latter-day Saint, that everyone needs these rights protected. So, you know, that interestingly enough, as a naive 21-year-old, that was my reaction. Well, if he was a prophet and he ran for president, why didn't he win? And then I checked the dates, and I'm like, oh, he was killed. You know, so yeah, I don't pretend to have any inside knowledge on God's thoughts about the election or what was going on there, but the saints themselves were very enthusiastic. It was, if you look through the newspaper accounts and the letters, there's little going on inside the church at the time that has a higher priority than this election. And they believed, and they also believed that Joseph's death, you know, without evidence, but they also believed that Joseph's death could be pinned on the entire United States, and that later, when they were obviously in the West during the Civil War, they thought that this was a punishment by God for what they had done to the Latter-day Saints and for rejecting Joseph. In fact, the government out there, the state government out there, during the Civil War, also met as kind of a ghost government afterwards, a council of 50-ish kind of thing, thinking that perhaps now was the time when the country would fall apart and they would have to be ready. And of course, again, it didn't happen then either.
I'd like to offer you a special compliment on the extraordinary work you did following the electioneers after the assassination and seeing the profound impact they had upon history, just playing out their lives primarily in Utah.
And not even completely in Utah, right? So each of the branches of the Restoration, Latter-day Saint Restoration movement, the leaders in those early years of each of those branches, overwhelmingly come from this same group of electioneers. So whether it was with Brigham, or whether it was with Strang, or whether it was with Rigdon or William Smith or Lyman White, or later with the reorganized church, the cadre's footprint was everywhere as far as the next generation of leadership.
Take us back to Joseph Smith's selection of Mr. Copeland as a possible running mate. The issue of slavery and trying to establish Zion in western Missouri, which had come into the Union as a slave state in 1820. And then here's Joseph trying to run some kind of run a church that was baptizing slave owners as well as those that were abolitionists. Trying to bring in Mr. Copeland as the vice president strikes me as being rather an unusual, strange, perhaps brave, but maybe foolish course of action. What do you think?
Well, so their first choice was the James Arlington Bennett that I've been talking about, who was a very influential man in New York. But they received false information that he had been born in Ireland. He hadn't been born in Ireland. He'd been born in New York. And so because they believed he'd been born in Ireland, they scrapped that plan and decided on Solomon Copeland, who Wilford Woodruff knew. In fact, Wilford Woodruff was the one responsible to write him and extend the invitation to serve as Joseph's vice presidential candidate, who had been in the legislature, who was a slave owner. In fact, the first converts in that town, that hamlet area, were two of his slaves. There's no evidence that he himself ever joined the church, but he had befriended Wilford Woodruff and other Latter-day Saint missionaries that had gone through there. Why they chose to select him, there's no official or actual evidence I could find. The fact that he had been in government and was from the South maybe was a decision in that sense. I'm not sure what they were thinking, other than maybe someone else with name recognition. And it was very common for platforms to be divided between North and South, right? That if the presidential candidate was from the North, that to bring someone on as vice president from the South, and vice versa. So there's probably that dynamic going on as well. And they don't hear from him. There's no record that he ever returned the letter, or even that he ever received it. We don't have any papers from him that still exist. And so they moved on to Sidney Rigdon later towards the end of April. So yeah, I'm not. Historians just don't know why, other than recognition and maybe to have kind of that North-South split. And who wouldn't be flattered, right, to be asked to be a vice presidential candidate?
I've wondered why Alexander Donovan wasn't considered. I see no evidence that he was.
No, but you make a good point.
Yeah, he would have represented the South, and certainly had the more favorable context for and history with the Mormons.
Correct. Yeah. No, I doubt he would have he would have taken it.
Well, I have another question that's going to take us back to your slides, if you would, please.
Yeah.
You have the slide of the red brick store, and that I don't remember what you had it with. Oh, you had it with the Council of 50. I happened to be in Nauvoo last weekend, and yes, that's the one. I was in the red brick store last weekend, and some tourists came in and saw a picture and noted that the chimney appears to be directly above the window and then above the doorway down below. And that was a very interesting archaeological puzzle. And your picture allows us to see the answer to it. But since you had that picture, I wanted to call it to our group's attention and see if anyone can see or perceive the answer to how it is they position that chimney directly above the window and above the bottom doorway. Now, Rick laid his hand up. He probably wants to talk about something else.
You can answer that question about the architecture first. I can wait a second.
I want to give anybody else a chance to jump on it if you can see a good explanation. If you look very closely, there's a stain that angles from the bottom of that chimney to the right and goes down between the windows and straight on down between the doorway and the windows on the right. They actually built that chimney at an angle up there to make it off center. I mean, they get centered on top of the building, but off center in terms of the other design. And so that water stain that apparently follows where the chimney was in that 1890 picture helped Bob Bray get the best answer there, I think. Anyway, just a bit of the archaeology and reconstruction process here. Fascinating little issues. And since I was there last week, I was reminded. All right, Rick, what do you have?
Well, first of all, Derek, it was fun having you on Gospel Tangents. So a lot of this was a little bit of a review for me, but it was fun to go over that. But
Good to see you again, Rick.
Yeah, my question is, because I still haven't read Spencer McBride's book, can you give is he worth interviewing? he just won Book of the Year, I know, but just kind of contrast his book with your book a little bit.
His book was published by Oxford University Press. It's mine has a little bit of a devotional flair to it on purpose. Mostly because as I spent all these years finding more and more missionaries and reading how significant this was and how many descendants there would be, I wanted to kind of play towards that angle as well as telling the story. His is strictly a political history. That he goes into much greater detail about the election, the wider election itself, right? So the candidates, the issues, the less on the nuts and bolts of Joseph's actual campaign. He has one chapter on the electioneers where he basically just keeps quoting me over and over again because why repeat the work when it's already there. It's a really good book. I've reviewed it for 2 different journals. He does a really good job of placing it in the wider American historical context, as well as he does my favorite part of his book is he does a really good job as he goes through the different things of Joseph Smith's platform, the slavery, the the judicial reform, the 14th, what would later become the 14th Amendment to apply the First Amendment and other amendments inside of the states. He does a really good job of not only placing it inside the context of the national discussion on those issues, but in, how I've talked about it coming from the revelations that Joseph receives. He does an excellent job of talking about them growing out of Joseph himself and his past experiences, more so than my book. And of course, his ends right at at Joseph's death, and that's the end of it. It doesn't continue the story of who they become. So they're very. Spencer and I are good friends. We've shared work together. We've presented together. We've worked on a couple of things together. He's well worth an interview, and brings a great, kind of a greater historical lens to it, as far as context.
I need to get him on. It's just that I had just had you and his came out, and I'm like, I don't want to do this twice in a row. But
Yeah,
I need to get him on for sure.
yeah, he's a good interview and a great man, great scholar.
Great radio voice too.
Yeah, his podcast series have been excellent.
Yeah, they're fantastic. I don't know if you guys have seen those. I know we did one on the First Vision. And you can tell they have a whole team. It's not like me going solo. They've got a team that puts the music and everything together. It's really well done.
Yeah, they do a great job.
Did an excellent presentation for us, and so I would give him. I agree with Derek in terms of the merits of both. I would definitely recommend that you would do well to pick his up as well, because it is it's more politically focused, whereas Derek's is more religiously focused.
Thanks.
Both have merits in my estimation, and one of the things about hosting perspectives, we get to see quite a lot of unique vantage points, and sometimes they are in conflict, but most of the time we can tolerate those irregularities and treat each other amicably.
Absolutely.
Here, I'm just going to add one more comment. I see Earl Watt said that Mitt Romney was an LDS member who ran for president. Newell Bringhurst wrote a book on all of the presidential candidates, including his father, George Romney, Ezra Taft Benson, Bo Gritz. There's quite a few in there, so I'll just recommend that. I'm trying to remember, there's 8 or 9 Mormons who have run for president. So
that is a matter of interest, but it is a matter of interest too that the nation has not been accepting of any Mormon president to this stage. Perhaps this neo-democracy stuff still hangs with us.
But his father, George, was accepted much more readily than he was. That can show you kind of the fluctuation of, of political outlook towards Latter-day Saints.
although Mitt got way closer than George did.
Oh yeah, I mean, he actually got the candidacy, right? And
right, yeah, George flamed out.
As far as criticism of, he didn't have George Romney didn't have a Governor Huckabee, talking about Jesus and Satan being, brothers and all that kind of stuff that kind of went on.
Well, that Robert Jeffers is the guy who drives me nuts personally, but
yeah, and go ahead.
Oh, did Mitt Romney not? Was George Romney? Did he cross lines a little bit more than Mitt at some points that might have gotten him in trouble?
That George or Mitt?
George. I know that he, like, for example, he not probably crossed lines because things were happening, but he was like pretty into like a civil rights, so that put him on the other side of Barry Goldwater, and was causing problems with what the Republican Party was kind of becoming. He's kind of at odds with it in some respects.
Yeah, that's very true. My point is that him being a Mormon wasn't an issue. Whereas for Mitt Romney, it was an issue, particularly inside the Republican Party. So yeah, you're absolutely right about George Romney, his support for the civil rights movement, and several other things that he did there in Michigan.
I think George's big problem was his comments about Vietnam, about how the generals brainwashed him or something. That just kind of did him in. It was his comments on Vietnam.
Yeah, Vietnam did a lot of things in the 60s, but I'm sure this group knows all about that more than I do.
That was someone over there. All right. Well, we're after 9:30, ladies and gentlemen. Yield any other questions or comments? But if not, let me sing, and then we can still have questions and comments thereafter. Good night, the Lord is watching o'er you. Good night, his blessings go before you. Good night, and we'll be praying for you. So good night, may God bless you.